Welcome everyone to our September meeting. We are the Triangle Apologetics community. I've got a couple of announcements here, and then we'll get into our presentation, The Psychological Science and the Life of the Mind with Dr. Jay Medenwalt. We are recording this meeting. I want to make sure I say that, although you should have heard something when you joined the meeting. We do post our meeting videos on our YouTube channel. In the video, you will only see the speaker's picture of whoever's happened to be talking in the video. However, right now, you can choose how you want to do it. You can see everybody or not. This is the screen where you select in Zoom, where you select which way you want to view people. And so you can choose speaker or gallery, any of those, and that's up to you. We are a group of men and women from diverse age groups, backgrounds, and levels of education who are interested in scientific research and general evidence that point to God's existence, character, and the Bible's reliability. Our topics lean towards STEM areas of interest, but are not limited to these. If you want to get on our email list, there's the address on the screen, triangle-apologetics-community@outlook.com. We also have a YouTube channel, which we started a few months ago, earlier this year. And so there's a few of the recent videos we've put up there. You can find us using Triangle Apologetics Community as the YouTube handle, or simply just go to your search engine and type in YouTube and Triangle Apologetics Community. I wanted to mention a couple things coming up later this year. In October, we're going to have a presentation called Is There Scientific Proof of the Soul? This is from a doctor of neuroscience. November, we have recent advances in cosmology and astronomy and their implications. And December 19th will be our Christmas social. This will not be on Zoom. This will be in person at our house. Some of you have been here before, so we're doing it again this year. So that's our schedule for the rest of the year. The Zoom meetings start at 7:30 Eastern, as we usually do. All right, so let me introduce our topic and then our speaker. Psychological science and the life of the mind. How can psychological or cognitive sciences help emphasize and develop the life of the mind? Are we humans as rational as we think we are? Why do humans have tendencies that often lead to unwarranted or false conclusions? What is cognitive bias and why is it so common? What is cognitive dissonance? What's the difference between critical thinking and wishful thinking? Is there a connection between spirituality, faith, and the life of the mind? So let me introduce Dr. Jay Medenwalt. As I mentioned a little bit before, he and I knew each other in Colorado. He's an assistant professor of psychology at Northwestern College, which is in Iowa. He served in the Air Force for 9 years as a behavioral scientist, which included teaching psychology courses at the Air Force Academy, consulting, and conducting research. He earned a doctorate in social psychology at Baylor with an emphasis on psychology of religion and virtue. He also earned a Master of Divinity in Apologetics, Ethics, and Biblical Studies, and a Master's in Psychological Sciences, and a Bachelor's in Behavioral Sciences. His research has been published by the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion, Current Opinion in Psychology, and Adolescent Research Review, and he has given presentations at the Christian Association of Psychological Studies, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, Evangelical Theological Society, and the Global Conference on Sport and Christianity. And he's working on a book that offers a scientific and theological critique of the Enneagram. So with that, let me welcome Jay Medenwalt.
Thank you everyone for coming. Just a couple things off the start. So my wife's actually out of town right now. She's speaking at an apologetics event in Dallas. And so my kids are good to go. They're all set, but it might be that I have to stop for a moment to help them out with something. They're 12 and 15, or 14, but so there shouldn't be any issues, but you never know. So just wanted to give you a little heads up on that. And also this presentation is very interactive. And so a lot of activities that we're going to do. And so get ready to maybe think, have some fun, but also feel free. I like conversation, discussion. So if you have questions, unmute yourself or put something in the chat and just let me know so that we can just make it more conversational. I think tends to be more fun that way. All right, so we start the life of the mind. So in general, and how I'm going to go about with this presentation is kind of focusing on psychological science or how psychology can help us essentially to think better. We often think of philosophy as kind of the area of thinking, and it certainly is that, and I love philosophy. But there's extra things I think we can add into that from a psychological perspective as we look at empirical evidence and understanding how people think. And so we hopefully can learn a little bit on how to think better, but also how to persuade others. So, um, we're going to talk a lot about bias today and hopefully recognizing where we might have some biases or how they might play a role in different areas of our life, but then recognizing that when we're trying to share the gospel with others or disciple other believers even, um, that they're affected by bias as well. So hopefully we can be more persuasive as we're more aware of the biases. And then hopefully uh, ideas in terms of how to model the good life. Right? So if you've ever heard it said, there are five gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the life of the Christian. Most people will never read the first four, right? So we don't have to be perfect, obviously, but if we can live exemplary lives, or at least in certain specific ways, I think that will make it a lot more persuasive when we do try to share the gospel with someone or disciple people who are really struggling to make a commitment in their faith or maybe stuck on a plateau. So to start, we're going to start with an activity. So for this round, what we're going to do is I'll read out a question here in a second. So when you come up with an answer, something pops in your head, type it into the chat. So if you want to get that ready right now, so you can type in your answers, and so you can do it one at a time. We'll look to see how we do as a group. I don't see where it is on my end. So I'll give you 10 seconds. So when everyone's ready, I'm just going to assume you're ready. All right. So name as many logical fallacies as you can. All right. Stop. Hit enter if you haven't hit enter. All right. So genetic fallacy, ad hominem, no such thing as absolute truth, begging the question, slippery slope, post hoc, ergo prompter hoc. Good. So that's usually about what I get. Usually get between, when I do this with groups, between 5 and 7 logical fallacies. And so you're all aware of them, as I can tell. And so now what we're going to do for round, if we look at the Wikipedia page, so I know Wikipedia is not the best source, but helpful for a list, right? So if you go to logical fallacies on Wikipedia, you'll get all these different fallacies, right? You don't have to know them all or pay attention. The point of this slide is just to show how many of them there are. And we see there are 4 columns here, right? Now what we're going to do, round 2, right? We're going to do the same thing, except it's going to be a little different question, right? So everyone ready? Now, this time I want you to name as many cognitive biases as you can. So go ahead whenever you're ready. All right, hit enter if you haven't already. All right, good. All right, so confirmation, disconfirmation, I don't know if that was meant to be 1 or 2 together. Black and white thinking, evidence, and chronological snobbery. And so when I do this activity, usually there's always less cognitive biases that people get. And usually what people come up with when I do this exercise is only confirmation bias. That's usually the one everyone has heard of and they know about. And usually when I do this in person, everyone's shouting out answers. It's usually someone will say confirmation bias, and then it's just crickets for the last 7 seconds or whatever, however long I do this. But again, if we look at Wikipedia, we see there's actually 5 columns of cognitive biases. So there are more cognitive biases, at least in theory, than there are logical fallacies. And some of these are overlapping or different name for the same thing, but you get the similar thing with the logical fallacies. And so, again, the point isn't necessarily go through and memorize these or talk about all these, and we'll talk about some of them, but just to recognize how persuasive or how pervasive different cognitive biases can be that we might have that can affect us in all sorts of different situations and in different ways. So who is biased? So religious people are biased, right? But so are non-religious people. And so this is an important thing to think about or to be explicit about, because there will be some people when discussing religion, they kind of have the perspective that, oh, well, religious people are biased and non-religious people aren't. And in fact, that was kind of my own view before I was a Christian. I became a Christian in college. I wanted to figure out what, if anything, was true about God, if we can know anything about God, and thinking that probably wouldn't find anything, and that I was kind of on the edge between deism and theism and atheism. So it's like some days I didn't think God did exist. Other days it's like, yeah, maybe some sort of God exists, but he just created the world and kind of just wants us to maybe be kind of good. And that was it. And so when I started looking into it and discovered all the apologetics and evidence and arguments for God, I was shocked. And I was like, well, maybe I'm just being fooled because I'm a college student and I don't know any better. And so I need to check to make sure this is true and accurate. I'm not being tricked. And so I need to go to the most unbiased people and see what they say. And so I wanted to see what atheist philosophers and scientists said, because in my perception, they were the unbiased people. But what we know from the research is basically, there certainly some exceptions, but as groups, categories of groups, religious people, non-religious people, Democrats or Republicans, right? Any sides of the political spectrum, people are about equally biased. And even, for example, intelligence, people think, oh, well, I'm intelligent, I'm too smart to be biased. Well, that's not the case either. So smart people tend to be just as biased as less smart people. Sometimes those are different biases that affect them, but in terms of evaluating evidence that goes with or against their opinion, tend to show the same amount of bias. So ultimately, pretty much everyone is biased. And so what do we do about this, or how do we manage that? Well, there's a little bit of a problem. So when I said who is biased, I saw a couple hands go up. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty typical. Everyone seems to recognize that they're biased or they have biases, even if they think they might overcome them. But in my experience giving this talk or similar ones or talking to people, everyone seems to think that they tend to know very little about bias. So it's one thing to say, okay, I'm biased, I can overcome it, but then not to be aware of which biases might be impacting your role in different judgments that you make, right? People tend to not actually actively try to overcome their biases. And we tend to think that others are more biased than us. So sure, I'm biased, but I'm not as biased as the person I'm talking to right now, or people of that other party or of those other beliefs. And so we call this the bias blind spot. So when we basically think that other people are more biased than us, or that we have transcended biases, that's called the bias blind spot. And that one specifically is one that actually seems to affect more intelligent people more, because when you are higher in intelligence, you typically are able to reason and think better. And so intelligent people tend to think that their views are more justified, even if it's something that they haven't looked into as much as they probably think someone else should. And so What do we do about that? We're going to do a quick little trivia game. So again, get ready in the chat. We'll give bonus points to whoever gets the answer first. Are you ready?
Ready.
All right. How many animals of each kind did Moses take on the ark? Dennis got it.
Oh, jeez.
Busted.
Yeah. All right. Another trivia question. Right. This one's going to be a little different. Right? So a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Quick, who's going to get it first?
No, because that's only 90 cents more.
Yep. Dennis fell into the trap. So the ball costs 5 cents and the bat costs $1.05.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Oh yeah, yep,
Our,
yep.
our intuitive answer, where what we want to say at first, is 10 cents. Right? So the question kind of primes us or directs us to think in that way. And so, when we just, especially when we're rushed, we put in the quick answer, it seems like it makes sense. Okay, there you go. And turns out it's not quite right. But then again, in a situation like this, if you're at the store and they charge you 5 extra cents for something, probably not something you're going to get all worried about. But we see these sorts of things play a role in a lot of our everyday sort of interactions. All right. One more trivia question. All right. So Linda is 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy as a student. She was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and she participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. So which of the following is more likely? A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and a feminist? So this one is an example where we have a fallacy and a bias running together. So the fallacy is called the conjunction fallacy, and the bias, we call it the representative heuristic. So Linda represents in our mind, so she's representative of someone we would think is a feminist, right? And so our initial reaction is to say B, she's a bank teller and a feminist. But the reason this is a conjunction fallacy is because in both cases, she's bank teller, right? But for answer B, she's a bank teller and a feminist. So if you think of overlapping circles of all the bank tellers in the world and all the feminists, right? They're separate circles. And so no matter how much they are or overlap, there's always going to be, it's always more likely that she's just a bank teller than a bank teller and a feminist, right? But again, it's that because she represents in our mind the stereotype maybe of what we have as someone who's a feminist, we kind of go to our go-to answer and just kind of assume that B is more likely. Although I see most of you got it right, but I did not give a C. That's correct. And that's part of the trick is to kind of force you to give an answer for this. And even with many of the other questions and things that we'll do, right? When we're kind of forced into a box, sometimes they don't make sense. Well, they make sense, but we have to kind of stop and think for a moment. So the question is, why are we biased? Do any of you have any thoughts on that? Ray says efficiency.
I, I heard it said, someone told me that, or I read it somewhere that my old brain, most stereotypes are true.
Yeah, so there's research on that. I actually talked about that today in class because in my intro psych class we're in the social psych chapter, and so we talked about stereotypes today. And so yeah, we there are a lot of stereotypes that are true. You know, men are taller than women. That's a stereotype, although we often don't necessarily think of stereotypes in that way. But um, there are a lot of stereotypes that are true. So men tend to be um, lower in the personality traits of neuroticism, so they're less anxious than women. That tends to be true. Um, so there's certainly a lot of stereotypes that do have a degree of truth to them, but even if they are general descriptors of groups, they don't necessarily describe individuals. But stereotypes are really helpful for us for categorizing the world, right? And understanding the world. And that's why, so from a design perspective or evolutionary perspective, I always tell my students kind of from either way, we get to the same conclusion, right? Is that biases are actually adaptive. They're beneficial for us. So the general view of how our mind works among scientists is that we kind of have a two-track mind. So we have a system one and system two is often what it's called. So system one, it's system one because that's the one that we're typically operating on. That's we're making decisions, we're living in the moment, we're moving through the world with system one. But system one is quick, intuitive system, right? System two is our deliberate, rational system, right? So sometimes it's been compared to like an elephant and a rider, where system one is like the elephant. The elephant's in control, but the rider sitting on top likes to think he's in control. And so it's sort of how our mind works is we think that our rational faculties are always in control, and they certainly do have the ability to take control, but often it's the elephant walking around without control and we don't realize it. But usually that's a good thing because our intuition, our quick reflexive thoughts, our decisions usually get us in the right place. They get us, I like to say, if you're taking a test on your system one, right? It's going to get you probably about a B minus, right? So you're shooting about 80%. So that's pretty good when we have so many decisions to make and quick decisions. You say, think driving, right? Something runs out in front of you in the road when you're driving. You don't want to sit there and deliberate about it. You need to make a decision quick right away. And so having these systems tends to be very adaptive and helps us function in the world. And so it's actually typically a good thing, even though we talk about bias as bad. And in terms of why it does, it saves us time and energy. So as humans, we tend to be cognitive misers. So we kind of often want to take the easiest route in terms of thinking because thinking is hard, right? If you want to research something, that can take hours, weeks, sometimes even years to come to a conclusion with a very difficult topic, right? Well, that's hard work. It takes time, a lot of effort to think. So I heard one study. I don't know if it was actually a published study or where this got this from, but it came from a psychology book from an actual psychologist. But that competitive chess players, when they play in tournaments, they can burn upwards of 6,000 calories during a day during a competition. And that's sitting there doing nothing because again, it's hard work for us to think. And so having this adaptive system to be able to rely on our intuition is really beneficial. We also see in terms of biases, it really helps to promote in-group, out-group behaviors, right? Which this can be both good and bad, but to just go along with your group, to get along with them, to agree with them, that promotes well-being for people. They get along better with other people that way. It helps quickly identify potential enemies or threats as part of the outgroup or people who disagree, right? And so we see a lot of kind of functionality, maybe not necessarily in many cases for us to find truth, but to be more social and to get along better with the people we care to get along with. And we also have a tendency as humans to default to truth. Right? So when someone tells you something, typically our default answer or our default response is to just assume they're telling us the truth. And again, this makes sense because usually people are going to tell you the truth. When you're driving down the road and someone flashes their lights on toward you to tell you, hey, there's a cop or there's a deer in the road or something like that, we kind of assume that it's true, and it's beneficial for us to assume that they're warning us about something than to just ignore it. Or if we think back in our distant ancestors, right? Someone comes and you pass them on the road and they say, hey, there's a lion over there. I wouldn't go that way. It's adaptive for you to assume they're telling the truth and listen, right? And maybe they're trying to hide some food or something from you or treasure, but in most cases, they're going to be telling you the truth. And so it's essentially from both kind of a combination of evolutionary or design mechanisms or even socialized reasons why we tend to have these biases, and they make sense. But is there anything wrong with bias? You're all saying yes.
Hmm.
What are some of the problems with bias?
It kind of prevents you from seeing the whole picture.
Mhm.
Or seeing the whole person. What's true of a group is not necessarily true of the individual. So you might rule somebody out, say, as a job candidate, and that person might have been the best person for the job.
Yeah, but on the other side of the coin, you may have opened that up and spent all this time and money and energy looking for someone
Sure.
when really you could have just hired your son and you would have got along with him and you would have done good work, and maybe someone else had something better on paper and so you hired them instead and then regretted it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate.
I have a personal story.
Yeah.
Coast Guard, back in my salad days, my youth. Um, we lived in a triplex while I was in aviation electrician's mate school, and our front door, around the front door neighbors, she we didn't know them, we just saw them. She was a little large. He looked like he was straight out of West Virginia, a bias there.
Mhm.
And after we'd been there 4 out of the 5 months, for some reason we interacted with them. She was an opera singer, and they were a delightful couple. And we had just, our bias had stolen a relationship from us, basically.
Yeah. Yes,
I've carried that with me imperfectly, but you know, learned it early.
yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And so, yeah, and it doesn't seem like you need to be convinced that bias is necessarily bad. It does have some adaptive functions. It does benefit us on one level, but it also strips us of opportunities in a lot of other ways. And so, just kind of quickly from a biblical perspective, ultimately, the problem, or where I see as a problem with bias, is because it can limit our ability to see or know the truth, right? So just a couple snapshots of some couple Bible verses on truth, and you all know truth is important, but we serve a God of truth, and truth matters and it's important. And so, where I've always focused in my own personal life and where my interest comes in studying bias is to always want to know the truth. And sometimes it's hard. There are hard truths that are difficult to accept. And sometimes we have to change our mind or maybe even apologize. But again, as hopefully we learn about it and gain in wisdom, those opportunities to have to apologize or feel the shame and embarrassment of being wrong about something that was maybe so silly uh, can help us, and we can avoid those situations moving forward. Right. And so in apologetics and evangelism, right, if we are biased, other people can often see they're biased, right? It's hard to see the bias of your own group, but when you're kind of undecided or you are outsider looking in, it's often pretty easy to see when people are biased. And so I think where this comes in importance for apologetics and evangelism is for our reputation and trust. Right? And so if I said, the earth is flat, and what was promoting flat earth, or you went on my social media and saw I'm posting a bunch of flat earth stuff, you wouldn't trust anything I say. right? It's how could you be so blind to reality and so many facts that show the earth is a sphere, right? And so we see a similar thing happening. I think that's an absurd example, I think, to kind of make a point, but it also helps avoid stepping on toes because at least as far as I know, when I bring that up, no one said I'm a flat earther. So, but it comes back to our reputation and trust. And if we are critical thinkers, careful thinkers, right? And we share the truth and love. I think that goes a long way in the way that we do apologetics and evangelism. And kind of my own 2 cents here, based on what I know from the research. But I think if Christians had the reputation generally as a group, right? The stereotype about Christians is that they are intelligent people and extremely kind, right? So if we had the Mormon reputation for kindness and maybe the atheist intelligence reputation for being intelligent, which isn't necessarily deserved, by the way, but if that's what our reputation was as Christians, I think there would be a lot more Christians in the world. And I think there would hardly be anyone throughout the whole world that's not a Christian if we had those 2 factors, because it goes such a long way. Even if the times we get things wrong, then there's other people that they can go to and trust. All right, so we're gonna do another activity. This time we're gonna look at perception, right? Because not just our judgment and decision making that is prone to bias, but also our perception, right? And so in this picture here, which monster is bigger? You stick a finger up or anything or something on there to measure, you'll see they're the same. Right, so the 2 monsters, right, they're the same size, but the one in back looks bigger because of the perspective and how it's drawn, right? So we got a few more of these. This one I think is even a little better. Which square is darker, A or B? And so A definitely looks darker, but when I remove the context, we see they're actually the same. Right, so I'll go back. It's because it's drawn in a shadow like that, it makes it seem darker. And so context actually plays a big role in how we perceive the world around us, right? And even how we make decisions. Couple more, right? Which line is longer, the top one or the bottom one? And so this is the inside line, not the arrows on the outside, but the inside line. You're all catching on it. So maybe I should ask, which one looks longer? Right? The top one? Does the top one look longer? Yeah. All right. Yeah. So you all got this, right? So they're the same, even though the top one looks longer. All right. And one more similar thing, just a little different lines, circles this time. Which one's longer, the left or the right? So this one, I actually pulled a trick on you. The right one's actually longer. So this illusion works like the other one just before it. The one on the right should look shorter. The one on the left should look longer. But because I made the one on the right a little bit longer, usually this is done to make them look the same. And we've just been going through a bunch of things where it's same, right? I kind of got you thinking on cruise control, and you just kind of probably quickly looked at it and kind of like, oh yeah, they're the same, right? Even though they're actually different. So the idea here, how do we overcome our biases, right? When we're trying to think or work with other people. So the biggest thing you can do in situations is to slow down and just think. Because any of these things we did, these optical illusions that we saw, if you looked carefully, if you measured them, right, you would have definitely got the right answer. With the questions, when I asked you about the bat and the ball or the Linda problem, if I told you, hey, these are tricky, right? You could figure them out. You would know the answer. In fact, one study with the bat and the ball problem, there are other problems like that. We call it the cognitive reflection test. And so one study, what they did is they gave people that test with it's 3 different questions that are similar to that, but they put it in a really small, hard to read font. And by doing that, it slowed participants down. So they had to like squint and really think and focus. And when they did that, almost everyone got all of them right. Where usually the average for university students is like 1.5 right out of the 3 questions. And it was like 2.9 was the average number of right questions, right? So the biggest thing we can do when we come to whether it's a perceptual thing, it's trying to reduce ambiguity or make a decision, make a judgment, evaluate evidence is to just slow down and think carefully about kind of what the information is that we're hearing. The other thing that research has shown is really important is to seek alternatives, or maybe to say another way to question everything. So even your own side. So confirmation bias, right? That's the one that everyone typically knows. We fall into confirmation bias because we look for evidence to support our view. If you're looking for evidence to support your view, you will find it. That's why there are people who believe the earth is flat. They look for evidence to support their view. Right? So there's evidence out there for everything if you can kind of do the mental gymnastics or only search for that evidence, or you only look for explanations that support your view. That there's something out there for everyone. So if we want to think better, if we want to get rid of our biases, we have to look for alternatives. We have to actually ask those questions, whether it's asking those questions to Google or deliberately seeking evidence that goes against our view. And oftentimes we may not agree with it. And that's fine. But as we know what's out there, what's available, what other people are saying, that helps us better understand our own view, but also better see and come to conclusions that we know are even more firm. And so kind of similar thing with questioning everything, right? If we assume that when we hear someone speak or write and they're on our side, whether it's political, religious, whatever, when they share our view, even people that share our view get things wrong. And so by being alert and attentive, right, we can catch those errors or go and look at them, and that can help us remove our own bias. We don't necessarily have to go and correct them, but it does help us when we're trying to make our own decisions, because again, as that last kind of perceptual thing, when we're on cruise control and we're just going along and kind of accepting things, we're going to get things wrong. And then the last kind of point for overcoming bias is to just remain curious and humble. Right? And these tend to be qualities that we like in other people. When someone's really curious, I was going to put that in the chat. I was going to put that verse on there. It's one of my favorite verses, First Thessalonians. And so, but I didn't put it on there. I was trying to keep it concise. But yeah, that's a good one. It's also repeated in 1 John 4. So yeah, test everything, hold on to what is good. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So when we meet someone who's really curious, right, that tends to be infectious, and we like being around those people and discovering things or learning things from them or with them, right? So you're all probably familiar with Richard Feynman, right? That was kind of, if you think of Richard Feynman and you know anything about him, that was kind of like the thing that sets him apart. And he was very infectious in that, very curious and wanting to learn and know things, but also humility. And we all like to say we're humble. Well, we don't say it, but we think it often. And it's good. Hopefully, we as Christians, I think we should try to be humble, right? God opposes the proud, right? So, but that's often easier said than done, right? When we when we think we're right, or even when we know we're right, I think that's the hard part. When you know something really well, right, and you're very sure on it, and you are right, but someone's disagreeing, it's hard to remain humble and to be open to listen to them, let them express their view, even if it's wrong. And so keeping these in the back of your mind of being humble and curious, and maybe that curiosity is finding out more about why they believe what they do or the details of what they believe. But as we remain humble and curious, that can help us engage in conversations and help us be more effective when we're engaging in evangelism and apologetics. All right. So what about our memory then? Our memory is perfect. We're good there. So we're going to do a memory activity. All right. So I'm going to put a list of words up on the screen. I'll read them. And what I want you to do when I'm done, try to write down as many words as you can remember, or you can type them into the chat box. And then when you're done, or when I say time's up, then go ahead and hit enter and show everyone how many you got. All right. So no writing till the end. Everyone ready? Okay, here we go. Bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, doze, slumber, snore, nap, peace, yawn, drowsy. All right, write down all the words you can remember or type them in. Okay, go ahead and put your pencils down. So a couple things we can talk about here. So here's the list of words. All right. And so how memory works is we're actually much more likely to remember the words at the beginning of the list and the end of the list. Right. So the words at the beginning, we call that the primacy effect or primary effect. And that's because those words, when we heard them, we had more time to rehearse and repeat them in our head. Whereas the ones at the end, those words at the end, those are still in our short-term memory. So even though we haven't quite encoded them in long-term memory, they're still there because it's what we're working on. So we usually get more at the beginning and end of the list. So go ahead, just type your name or put something in the chat. So if you got the word bed, go ahead and say me. Okay, is that everyone? All right. And if you got the word drowsy, go ahead and say me. Or maybe we should do like a hands up thing. That might work better. So for this next one, we'll do that. So raise your hand. So for this next one, if you got the word sleep, put your hand up on the screen or the little emoji thing. All right, so we've got only two people. So here's the trick. Sleep wasn't actually on the list. So I'll go back through because usually when I do this, people don't believe me. So if we go back through, see no sleep on here anywhere. Back to the beginning. So why do you think a couple people had sleep? Usually it's about 50% of people will have sleep on their list.
Synonym.
Yep. Yeah, it's synonym to some of the words, but also all the words are about sleep.
Right.
So it kind of primes our brain to think about sleep. And so we're kind of racking our brains and trying to think, was sleep there? Yeah, it must have been. And so we write it down and we often think it was there. So this is the beginnings of a false memory, right? And we know from research that false memories occur. And so in the lab, researchers have done some cool experiments. I'll just tell you about a couple of them. So one, they did a Disneyland experiment. So they had participants, college students come in and bring a picture of themselves when they were at Disney, right? Or they asked them if they'd been to Disneyland. And then they reached out to their parents and got a photo of them at Disney, and they actually photoshopped them with Bugs Bunny. Well, Bugs Bunny is not a Disney character, right? So there's no way Bugs Bunny would have been at Disneyland. And so they photoshopped this in there, and then they brought the participants back in and then asked them about the time they saw Bugs Bunny and they didn't remember it, right? But then they showed them the picture, they had the evidence, right? And so like, oh, okay, yeah, well, I guess I just don't remember. And then a week later, they brought him back in and asked him again. And like, oh, maybe I kind of remember, but I'm not sure. And after a few times of doing that, people started to develop these full memories about things that they did with Bugs Bunny and the interactions they had with Bugs Bunny at Disneyland, right? Or another one they've done is a car accident. So they have participants watch a video of a car crash. And so the car crash really happens. They don't change that. But what they do is they ask them questions afterwards. How fast was the car going when it bumped into the other car? But then for some people, they change one word. How fast was the car going when it smashed into the other car? How far was the car going when it collided with the other car? And so they do all these different words. And they found that when they used the word smash versus the word bump, there was about a 20-mile-an-hour difference in their perception. So when they used the word bump, they estimated it was about 15 or 20 miles an hour. And when they used the word smash, they estimated it was around 40 miles per hour, right? And so they all saw the same event, they're all in the same situation, but then they were asked the question in a different way that changed their memory of the event. We call that retroactive interference. So that information that they got about the car hitting, crashing, bumping, colliding, right? That information was kind of a leading question. It retroactively interfered with their memory of the event and the perception. And so this has real world implications we see for like eyewitness testimony. And so there's been lots of cases, eyewitness testimony, where people were later exonerated with DNA or they found video camera footage or something where someone was wrong. In maybe one of the most striking examples, there was a woman, I think it was Australia or New Zealand. She was sitting in her home watching TV when someone just barged in her house and then raped her. And then she said she made a conscious effort to stare at her perpetrator and memorize his face and what he looked like. And then she happened to see him, I forget if it was in person or on TV a week later or something like that, called the police and told them, and they arrested him. The problem is the guy they arrested had an ironclad alibi. He was actually on live TV when she was raped, giving an interview. So that's the TV program she was watching. So even though she was sure I'm encoding my perpetrator's face in my mind, I want to remember and make sure he gets arrested, she encoded the wrong person's face into her mind, even though she thought she was getting the right person, right? And so that's a very striking example and very rare to happen, but we see these sorts of issues pop up a lot with eyewitness testimony of getting things right. Was it this person or that person? Did they have a gun or not have a gun? All these sorts of things. But then maybe something you're all familiar with, the satanic panic. Remember back in the 80s and 90s, there was this big panic that there were a bunch of satanic cults that were molesting, murdering, and cannibalizing children, often abusing them at daycares. And there were something like 20,000 plus accusations and thousands of people accused. the problem is they never could only find physical evidence. And from what we know, there were probably certainly some kids that were abused, but because things got lost in this panic, right? Those real victims probably had nothing to do with Satanism, right? But that got lost in kind of the wash of this panic, and all this was thrown out. But the problem is a lot of well-meaning people used some of these leading questions, right? Like the bump versus smashed when they were interviewing the children, or gave them information that then they started to develop, the kids started to develop false memories of other kids being abused or themselves being abused, and these things never happened. And now, even now to today, many people believe they were abused, and their abusers got off without any crime or without any doing any time, when probably what we know from just about every of those situations, at least part of the satanic panic, was that the false memories were created in these children and they weren't abused. Again, recognizing with that many accusations, there probably were some real abuse cases, but probably not attached to any satanic cult. And then even with 9/11, so 9/11 happened, I'm not denying that. But what happened with 9/11 is researchers interviewed people right after it happened. They asked them, the week after it happened, where were you when the second tower hit? What were you doing? Who were you with? These types of questions. So this big impactful event creates flashbulb memory for most people. You probably remember exactly where you were when you heard the news, right? And so they interviewed them the week after it happened, and then followed up with them a year or several years later and interviewed them again and asked them the same question. And even with this being a very clear, vivid memory, some of their memories have changed. They said they were at their apartment when they were really at work. They said they were with their spouse when they were with their child, right? So some of these details changed, even though it was a big, impactful, vivid flashbulb memory. Yeah, what's your question?
That could have implications for apologetics. And if you're going to get to this, or if I'm going off track, just correct me. But Frank Turek talks a lot about impact events and uses 9/11 as an example. And he bridges to the apostles were not likely to forget the details of the resurrection because that was an impact event in their lives. So if we're capable of changing memories, even for something like 9/11, are we capable of changing them for the resurrection? Now, I believe the apostles. That's not what I'm coming at. But how would you answer that counter argument, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'll pay you afterwards for the transition.
Okay. Hey, am I good or am I good?
Thank you for the assist on that. Yeah. This is a critique sometimes you hear from atheists, and if they're aware of how false memories work or are created, and they say, well, the resurrection, how do we know it wasn't a false memory? The stories weren't written down until 30 years after, or anything like that. It could have been false memories or imagination inflation. So this is where over time details creep into our imagination and fill in kind of the gaps, right? And that definitely happened. So did that happen with the resurrection? How would any of you respond? Or how did Frank respond in your memory?
I would jump in to say it would seem strange that they would all have the same false memory.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because they were sitting around talking about it together and planning it, right?
But the apostles ended up scattering, right? So it's always possible that they colluded a bit at the beginning, but some end up in Rome, some at least traditionally in India. Thomas may have gotten as far as India. So they weren't exactly texting back and forth and saying, oh, I said this, you'd better get the story straight about how many angels there were.
Yeah. And so there's a video from Cross Examine from Frank Turek, who he discusses this question. Frank talks about an impact event, and I think Frank does a decent job answering it. And that's what we see in the research, is that when things like this happen, people get the main gist right. No one says, you know, there wasn't a plane. Anyone who was there saw it. No one's saying there wasn't a plane, or that no one's saying that someone was resurrected from the Twin Towers collapsing, or things like that. And so we do tend to get these things right. We also have collaboration from multiple sources, where we, again, so if you and your spouse are debating exactly where you were when it happened, right? Then you recognize that maybe you have a little bit of a disagreement, and you maybe have a third party source, someone that can correct you or tell you what's right. And with the resurrection, we have multiple eyewitnesses agreeing, seeing things that wasn't there. It was something unexpected, so it's not something they would have created on their own, likely. And so even though we do know false memories can happen, right? We don't get things wrong that weren't there like this to this degree. Like Frank says, like a big impactful event. We might get some of the details wrong. Like you could argue that maybe that's why there appears, at least on the surface, to be a discrepancy on how long Jesus was in the tomb or something like that, right? But no one's saying no, he wasn't resurrected at all. And that doesn't really match the pattern for what we see with false memories of creating something that we didn't think was going to happen. It's, these false memories come in over time. They're kind of trivial details of what happened. And so what we know from the research is that the resurrection doesn't fit that pattern. It's too much. It would be too much to say it was a false memory, especially when we factor in something like the Apostle Paul, right? It's one thing to say, well, Peter, the Apostle Peter, had a false memory, and then he told the other apostles. It's like, well, what about Paul, who was persecuting them and then had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, right? He definitely wouldn't have had a false memory about that event. The other thing to keep in mind too, and it's sometimes presented as a negative. So if any of your kids or maybe grandkids ever watch the Chipmunk movies, the bad guy in that, I forget his name in the movie, but the actor, his name's David Cross. He's a comedian, and he's got a stand-up routine where he talks about how, the Bible was written, rewritten, edited, translated, rewritten, copied, rewritten, right? And he goes on and on about this. And then at the end, he goes, and all by people who couldn't read and write. And that's supposed to be his big extra gotcha moment at the end. The problem is, what we know from research with oral cultures is they actually tend to have better memories. They're less prone to false memories. They value more prizing memory and being able to memorize things correctly and accurately, and to correct each other when they get it wrong. And so the fact that they couldn't read or write, or most people couldn't, actually is evidence that it's less likely they were affected by false memories, because memory was so important for them. And we have research with this with oral cultures today who are kind of detached from the modern world. Researchers have gone in and done studies with them on memory, and their memory tends to be much better than ours. But when we can rely on pictures, writing things down, dictation, and things like that to store things. And so there's a few books out there that talk specifically about memory. One specifically that might be helpful is from Nick Meter. He's a psychologist, and he wrote this book recently on evidence for the resurrection. And he pays a little extra more attention to some of the psychological aspects around memory, or even cognitive dissonance, which is kind of the last point. Get to cognitive dissonance and how this plays a role. Dennis, what time did you want to end at? Or open it up for questions?
We can end anytime in the next few minutes is fine.
Okay, let's try to figure out how long I want to belabor this point.
Okay, and we have John, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Regarding the apostles' testimony, to me the most impactful, to borrow a word, is J. Warner Wallace's the fact that all of their descriptions of the events of Jesus' life, they don't align perfectly. And that's what you expect from real eyewitnesses. If they had colluded, they would have been much more similar.
Right. All right. So cognitive dissonance is basically cognitive dissonance theory says that when we recognize that we have some sort of inconsistency in our beliefs, we experience discomfort or dissonance. Right. And so, often it's between two beliefs or maybe belief in reality or something like that. And so as a result of that discomfort we feel, we try to reduce it. So pretty simple, straightforward. We recognize an inconsistency that makes us feel uncomfortable, and so we try to reduce that. And so how do we try to reduce that? We often do that by trying to rationalize. Now, it's often presented as cognitive dissonance as like a bias, and it often case is, but it can also lead us to change our minds in good ways as well. Maybe it isn't the normal case, but it certainly can do that, right? And so with cognitive dissonance, the classic study with this is researchers brought in some college students and had them turn pegs for half an hour, right? Really boring task. That was the point. It's supposed to be really boring, the most boring thing they could think of. And then afterwards, then they interviewed them about what they thought about the task. And then they said, my research assistant couldn't make it. Would you mind filling in for him and telling the next participant that it was really fun? And if you do that, I'll pay you. I'll pay you either, at the time it was either $1 or $20, but that was the 50s. And so adjusted for inflation, it would be about $5 versus $100. And so some participants were paid, I'll just say $5 to tell a lie. Some participants were paid $100 to tell a lie. And so they told the lie, they're going out the door, and the researcher's like, oh, wait, hold on. I forgot to ask you a couple more questions. And then ask them, okay, how fun was the task for real? And any guesses what they found? Who said it was more fun? The $5 or the $100 group?
Yeah, I would think the $100 group would say it was more fun.
That's the intuitive answer.
I think $5 because they have less to. Wait a minute, that doesn't make sense.
Nope, you've
I
got
don't
it.
know.
They felt
think of it
less
this way.
guilty about lying.
So when they were paid $100 to tell a lie, right? They're like, oh, I did it for the money, right? But those who were paid only $1 or $5 an hour time is like, I wouldn't lie for that minuscule amount. And so their kind of mental gymnastics, how they rationalize that is, oh, it must have actually been kind of fun. Now, it didn't completely change their view. They still said it was boring, but the $1 or $5 group, they said it was more fun than the other group that got paid more. So with cognitive dissonance, again, the idea is that we want to look for, have something to justify our actions or our beliefs, right? And if we have nothing to turn to, then we might turn to rationalizing that. And so right before the Leon Festinger did that study, he actually was still developing this theory. He actually infiltrated a cult. And so this was in the 50s. He heard a news story about a cult that was predicting the end of the world. They said that aliens were going to destroy the world. They've been receiving messages from them, and they're going to destroy the world on December 23rd, 1955. And so he heard about this, and he sent some research assistants to join the cult. It was a benign cult. They weren't doing harm or anything. And so what he predicted was that after this, after their failed prediction, they would actually become more committed to the group, not less committed. And he predicted this because of cognitive dissonance. If they put in this time, money, energy to be part of this group and to make these statements, then when those statements were proven false, then they would become more commitment. They would double down, and that would be the way they would reduce their dissonance. And so sure enough, when the time came and the world didn't end, there was a period of discomfort. They were unsure, not sure what was going on. And then their prophet, the lady, part of their group who was receiving the messages, received another message from the aliens. And they had told her that they were so faithful and they did such a good job that the aliens decided not to destroy the Earth. So
Mm-hmm.
after that, the group was sort of passive. They weren't actively trying to recruit members. But now afterward, after they had saved the world, now they were out trying to share their group and recruit more members. Because again, they were trying to overcome that dissonance and make themselves feel better about this. And so in the book where the psychologists talk about this, they also give the example of the Moonies. And so the
Mm-hmm.
Moonies predicted the end of the world and did come. And then again, that actually led to increased um, commitment to the group instead of people just saying, oh, I guess I was wrong and walking away, because that's essentially too hard of a pill to swallow. And there's a somewhat popular YouTube video now that probably a couple of them now, but they try to explain the resurrection in terms of cognitive dissonance and say, well, the apostles committed so much to Jesus when he died, they couldn't fathom it, they couldn't understand it. And so cognitive dissonance kicked in and they created this story that unconsciously that he was resurrected, and then they started promoting that belief. Problem is the evidence we have from the Gospels and other parts of history doesn't match with what we know from cognitive dissonance. So one big issue, which maybe seems like a little thing, but it's a pretty big thing, is when, for example, when the Moonies were wrong about their prediction, they changed to, oh, well, Jesus really wasn't coming back in person, he was coming back in spirit, right? And so if cognitive dissonance wasn't playing a role, or if cognitive dissonance was playing a role in the resurrection, the apostles wouldn't have claimed a bodily resurrection. They would have claimed, oh, Jesus was resurrected in spirit. They wouldn't have said, oh, where's his body? Because with cognitive dissonance, it's not that people are intentionally trying to deceive others, right? It's that they've essentially done mental gymnastics to even fool themselves. And so they wouldn't have gone and stole the body and then told other people, hey, look, see, the body's gone. They would have just said, no, he was spiritually resurrected, and we can all be spiritually resurrected as well. And again, so that I would say that's a big one. But other factors is that, again, there were other eyewitnesses who saw the resurrected Jesus. With cognitive dissonance, we would expect maybe those closest to him to have a vision or hallucination of him, and that was it, not confirmed by 500 other people or other converts. We would just expect it from them, but that's not what we see. And also, like before, it also doesn't explain Paul's conversion, because he certainly wouldn't have had cognitive dissonance about seeing Jesus since he was persecuting Christians. So ultimately, kind of application takeaway, as we hopefully have learned a little bit more about bias and so many different ways that they can sort of creep into our mind in different ways, can help us to slow down and think so we can minimize our own bias, but also recognizing that when other people, when they're not Christian, if they're open or if they're actively hostile toward the gospel, they're still going to be affected by bias. It's still going to be, well, I heard from so and so that, this happened or that happened, and there's going to be this constant battle. And so hopefully by recognizing all these ways in which we can maybe see some bias in fun little activities, we can be more patient as we talk to others and have those discussions with them and disciple them, and hopefully be a light that helps bring them to faith. And that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
I do, but I'm happy to yield to somebody that hasn't spoken up yet. I had read recently that institutional review boards really got going after World War II and the determination not to allow that kind of human experimentation again. But the seekers cult that you just described was from the mid-50s. Please tell me they somehow eluded their IRB, because I cannot imagine an experiment like that being approved. Even I can see all kinds of problems with it, and I'm a humble copy editor, not a real researcher.
Yeah, so IRBs were created, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s. So
Okay.
there's still some time after World War II, before they were created. And so, yeah, it's difficult to know if an IRB would approve it because part of it depends on the institution. But in a case like this, if when you say, okay, these are trained people or actors they know, like the world's not going to end, we have no reason to suspect this group's going to be violent, maybe they would allow them to go in.
Okay.
Because they don't really have participants, they're just going in to observe. But the IRB would certainly want to know if the research assistants are at risk. And so maybe they would say, no, you have to do it yourself if you want to get this data, because I know there's like a sociologist, sometimes they do dangerous research, right? So one example I can think of where he actually went and joined up with basically a gang, and he walked into this gang and just said, hey, I'm a researcher. I just want to see what you're doing. And it took him a while to build trust, but he was in the thick of things. He wasn't participating in what they were doing, but he was just there observing them. And eventually they kind of opened up and they would let him be there. But he wasn't having anyone else go in and do that. He took that risk on himself. So yeah, it
Mm,
would be interesting to try to get that through an IRB for sure. But even if they said no, like a researcher is free to do what they want with their own body in that sense.
mhm.
This is not a question, but I've been reading through a book that I think fits well with what you described. I'm going to put the name of it in the chat, but it's called Clear Thinking in a Messy World by Ken Samples, A Christian Guide to Logic, Reason, and Cognitive Bias. I'll just put that there. Um, I've been going through it. I'm partway through it. I'm in the section where they're dealing with all these cognitive biases. They're not addressing every one that you listed from Wikipedia, but they're going through many of them.
Yeah, that book is on my list of ones that I want to get and read because books like that I like to know and see if they're good resources to recommend.
Mhm.
Um,
I
see the
would say it is. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and it's quite good. And um, yeah, a lot of examples, and yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
How old are people when they can begin to form legitimate memories? Since we were talking about the kids at the daycares, um, like, are you 3 years old and you can remember something that really happened to you later in the absence of getting leading questions like that, just ordinary memories? How far back do they typically go?
So in the US or in Western countries, it tends to be around age 5 is when people usually have their first memory.
Mm-hmm.
In collectivist cultures, the individual is not as important. And so they tend to be around 7 or so when they typically have their first memory. Um, but with that, there are exceptions for sure. So some people have their first memory much younger. Like my first memory is from probably when I was about 3 years old. Um, but the problem is even with those memories that old or that young, like we don't often have ways to confirm whether they're true. So even though
Right.
there's a real event and I know that happened, I still have a scar on my finger from it. Um, my actual memory of it, I'm okay with saying it might be a fictional memory.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. So it's hard to know unless we have like good video evidence or something of it. Um, but yeah, and that's another thing with like the false memories is they're much more susceptible when we're young. So
Mm-hmm.
we certainly can get false memories as adults, or our memories can get changed. So actually, when we learn something or see something, anything we encode into our memory, so we encode it, then we store it, and then we retrieve it when we want to remember it. We tell someone about it, if or for my students, right, when they have to take a test. Well, that act of retrieval reactivates the memory, and so then we re-encode it, and every time we do that, it's potentially able to be changed.
Mm.
Which again, this is adaptive because if I tell you something, right, and then you add details to that, right? I tell you some cool fact I learned about the universe, and then you add some details. I want to be able to encode those details and include that as part of my memory moving forward. But the downside is that sometimes it can change in negative ways too.
Mhm.
My earliest that I can remember, I was worried about how Santa Claus was going to find me because we were going to my grandparents for Christmas, which was unusual. And I got a tricycle that I have pictures of me in the construction of an addition to the house, which was done when I was either 2 or 3. So I'm pegging it to my Christmas just before I turned 3 in January.
Pretty good.
But I tell that all the time, so maybe I've just reinforced it. I don't know.
I have a question about age and these studies. I noticed you referred to several studies where you had college students came in and did this and that and the other. Is that, do you get different results if you had a bunch of 50 somethings coming in and doing the same thing, other than it might be harder to get those 50 somethings all in the same room at the same time?
No, so a lot of these studies started. So Elizabeth Loftus is like the kind of big memory researcher, and she started doing her memory studies in the 70s. And so back then, psychology was still mostly doing studies with college students. But since then, we've done these studies with people of all different age groups, and we see similar things, or even in like to show, like in our example, I've done when I read that list of words. I tend to get people from all different ages, and I can't really predict who's going to say sleep and who's not. And if anything, I would say it tends to be people who are more intelligent tend to get sleep. So I actually did that exercise with Reasonable Faith chapter directors at a conference so William Lane Craig was there, and William Lane Craig had the word sleep on his list. I also did it with Craig Blomberg, and he had sleep on his list. And so, yeah, it's we see these things regardless of age. But again, when we're really young, they're more susceptible to bigger changes than when we're older. So I think was it Tom Brokaw a few years ago, and maybe 5 or 10 years ago, he had that incident where he recalled being doing journalism with the troops or something, and his aircraft was shot at or something, a helicopter, and then they found out, no, it wasn't your aircraft, it was someone else's. That was probably just a normal kind of slip of memory where we're in this heated sort of event. He still probably had adrenaline going, time had passed, and so his memory of seeing that became memory of it happening to him. And so sometimes that'll happen with spouses, right? Where our spouse does something and they're like, we think later that we did that, or instead of just hearing about it. So yeah, those things definitely happen to us throughout life, but they are more likely and susceptible to change when we're kids.
Yeah, it wasn't Tom Brokaw, it was Brian Williams.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay.
There you go. There's my false memory right there. Wrong guy.
Yeah, Tom Brokaw had retired, I think, by then.
Okay.
Well, I think this is good stuff. Anybody else have questions? Okay, I don't see any other questions, and great. Well, thanks, Jay. This is good stuff. This we will yes, people are applauding. I'll applaud.
Yeah.
This is being recorded, so we'll get this up on our YouTube channel in the next day or so, probably, and then I'll send the link around to everybody so you can all see it.
Thanks very much.
All right.
Thank you
Interesting.
all.
Thanks, Jay.
Good night.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good
Have
night,
a good
all.
night.